So I have been asked to share a little bit about the idea of faith and science. I think it's an important topic. Studies have shown that one of the main reasons that people leave Christianity is because of their inability to reconcile their faith with what they think are the facts around science. So it's something that's worthy of giving thought to if for our own understanding and to be able to give answers to other people. I think the primary tendency has been to uh, cave on what we believe and change it based on what science shows. And I think that leads back to what's called the Copernican revolution. The Copernican revolution goes back to Nicholas Copernicus in Poland, and he proposed that the Earth went around the sun versus the sun going around the Earth. That seems like settled science and a fact. Um, very few people disagree with that, but the challenge and the reason it was a revolution is because it was through that painful process that Christendom learned to put the findings of science ahead of theology and uh, biblical interpretation. If you look at before that time, Christianity for some 1500 years had universally accepted that the sun went around the earth. And then uh, Copernicus proposed something different. It lay dormant essentially until Galileo started to promote the idea fairly aggressively, and it caused a lot of tension. And then ultimately the acceptance that the earth moves around the sun. Later, much later, with Darwin and evolution, uh, it was proposed that um, man essentially evolved from lower forms of animals, but in the original idea, there was still the thought that God had created a certain series of um, uh, life beings from which all the current animals and plants evolved from. Obviously, that evolved to a more general theory where the universe started on its own through accidental causes and chance, and through successful or beneficial things happening, those stuck, and the unbeneficial things fell away. And through that process, um, we now have the universe and human beings and all life as we know it. This segment is only meant to be a short 15-minute segment, so to me, really an introduction to faith and science from what I hope is at least a different perspective than what you've heard in the past. My background, my day job is a financial advisor, but my degree is in biotechnology, and I've had a passion for physics, cosmology, biology for nearly 20 years. I don't consider myself any kind of expert, but I do consider myself somebody who really cares a lot about both faith and science and doesn't like to see them in conflict. Two different sources of truth should not um, cause problems, they should resonate with one another. And so, what I've found over the years is that being very careful on the theological side and very careful on the scientific side, and looking for how the data overlaps with the biblical understanding of the worldview, and at the same time understanding that the writers of the Bible didn't have our detailed understanding of science, and understanding that revelation is able to give us greater insights into the world around us. I think it's a fundamental mistake to change our worldview every time science comes out with a new theory or a new idea and proposes it as fact. In my experience over the years, science gets it wrong way too many times. So, uh, what I would encourage everybody to do is to question your assumptions. about what you've been taught. Open your mind without fear. To be a skeptic doesn't mean that you just don't believe things. It means that you hesitate to draw a conclusion. I think what makes the most sense is to look at the data, both the biblical data and the scientific data, and try to understand it before coming to a conclusion. I started from the standpoint that both evolution and the geocentrism or heliocentrism, where the Earth goes around the sun, were facts. As I got into my biology degree, not through any biblical influence, but just understanding the complexity and the design of things, like how the genetic data is coded, how much of it there is, how it's packed, how it's copied, how RNA is transcribed off of it, and then proteins are translated off of it. The statistical probability of any of these things happening by chance is virtually zero. From a physics perspective, it seems pretty obvious that the universe can't be infinitely old, because that would require an infinite amount of time, which would mean that energy would be spread out evenly, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So that means that there had to be a beginning, which requires that there was a time without time. Well, obviously, change requires time, and going from no universe to a universe is pretty significant change, which would require time and a cause outside of the universe. So it seems pretty intuitive from a physics perspective and a mathematical perspective that there had to be a being that had infinite power and that was outside of time. So, if something created God, then God wouldn't be God. That thing that created God would be God, and so there has to be a being that's uncreated and that has enough power to go from 0 to 1, and that's an infinite change. So that would require infinite power. That's a lot of concepts in one place. But my point with it is that the physics and the math show that the universe had to be created by an infinite being, and that being had to have infinite power and outside of time, which is fundamental beliefs about our understanding around God. And you can continue to take that concept further, asking why would that infinite being do such a thing? And to make a long story short, it seems to me there's only two reasons that anybody does anything. It's required, it's needed, or it's wanted. Well, an infinite being outside of God, outside of time, cannot require our existence for his existence. So therefore, it would seem that being did it because he wanted to. And it would seem that the reason that he wanted to was because such a being would know greater than and less than, and would know that it's greater to love outside of oneself than not to, and to love a limited being, especially a sinful limited being, is a pretty high form of love. And so his nature seems to have propelled him to create a universe in order to create a being in his image and likeness, allow him to fall so that he could love something that's not fully worth of love, and redeem that and unite that with himself. It would seem that is a logical mathematical consequence of the universe existing. It does have a corollary, which is the whole universe is therefore created for man, and man for God. So man is not some kind of appendage in the universe. He's the fundamental reason that the universe exists. You can read this in Genesis, that God created the sun and moon and stars for signs and seasons, days and years on earth. and in the beginning he created heaven and earth. You can see from Revelation that the whole reason that the universe exists is for man and man for God. People say that it's an awfully big universe, and that's obviously true, but it's also an awfully small universe. Like if you look down to the smallest possible scale, which is called Planck length, the largest possible scale being the size of the universe, man just so happens to fit halfway between those two, meaning 2 meters is about halfway between Planck length and the size of the universe. It would seem that the universe is perfectly carved out for human life, and that it is designed for human life. And that has some real spiritual consequences in that we're not here to do as we please, we're here to do as God pleases, and that the earth is a sort of altar upon which we sacrifice our life and to have unity with God. What I'm trying to show in just a few minutes is that there is a beautiful synergy between faith and science. Rather than there being these false conflicts, there's a synergy. So to take a slightly different angle, if you look at the theory of evolution, I don't know if any of you believe it or all of you believe it, but in my studies there's very, very little evidence of it, and there's substantial evidence that it's not true. There's very little evidence that the universe is old, and there's substantial evidence that it's young. Think of the salinity in oceans, for example. There's very little salt in the oceans, but it's constantly being put in. How does that happen? There's also very little evidence that the Earth moves. In fact, the theory of relativity says it can't be in absolute motion because it says all motion is relative. And there's very strong evidence that the Earth is at the center of the universe and that the sun goes around the Earth and the planets around the sun, which would be a topic for another video. This one has been asked to be 15 minutes, and so I'm coming up on about 12 and a half, and that seems like a good place to stop.